Greetings all! Since it seems to be a topic which comes up from time to time, I thought a quick video on the history of upgunning the M4 medium tank might be in order. There are a number of common misconceptions going around which I have addressed in other videos, such as the idea that US's tanks were not supposed to engage other tanks and that's why the Sherman did not come with a 76mm until late in the war. Indeed, there is an opinion that the US introduced 76mm only after the initial fighting in Normandy saw the 75mm as wanting. Although technically true, this latter position is often used to imply that the 76mm was developed and installed onto the M4 only as a reaction to the German tanks, as opposed to having been something developed long before they were encountered. The history of the 76mm gun on the M4 medium is an excellent example of the process lag in between somebody coming up with a good idea and actually getting it implemented into the field. In the immediate prelude to World War II, US medium tanks were generally built around machine guns. Lots and lots of machine guns. However, like other nations such as the UK, the question was asked, what happens if we come across an enemy tank? Until then, the US Army didn't have an anti-tank gun of any sort in service beyond possible use of the .50 caliber, which in fairness wasn't actually bad against most tanks of the era. Still, once the 37mm had been adopted as the towed gun, it wasn't too much of an issue to mount the 37mm onto a turret to give the tank a better anti-tank capability. T5E2 was an experiment to see if the 75mm gun would be better at the anti-infantry role than all the machine guns, and this proved to be effectively the prototype concept for the M3 medium tank. However, the successful invasion of France and the emphasis given to the use of panzers resulted in two decisions. The first was the creation of a tank destroyer force. This led to the question of what the best weapon would be to destroy enemy armor. Although the 3-inch gun was available and trialed, no vehicle suitable for mounting it was available. Eventually, the tank destroyers were fitted with 37mm guns in the light platoons and 75mm guns in the heavy platoons, as the best tank destroying weapons the US Army could field. Simultaneously, work was being undertaken to increase the firepower of the medium tank. The best gun that could be fielded in a medium tank was, again, 75mm. Actually, a slightly more modern 75mm than that found on the M3 tank destroyers, but similar enough. It was a natural progression to move the same 75mm to the M4 when it entered production after the M3 in early 1942, with instructions put out to see whether the 3-inch gun or the 105mm howitzer could also be installed as an alternative. This is why the M4 came with such a large removable gun shield. Any gun was supposed to be installed into the same turret, just simplifying production, you just add the module. So again, the M4 was being built with the best gun that the US had which could be put into the tank. It wasn't anything to do with tank destroyer doctrine or artillery doctrine or the capability of high explosive or any of the other claims going around. In the meantime, experiments to get the 3-inch gun onto the battlefield continued. It proved difficult as the gun, not intended for vehicle mounting, proved to be rather large, heavy and cumbersome for most vehicles. Some of these attempts, such as T40 or T57, are to be found in World of Tanks. Eventually, it was decided that with a purpose-built, simple turret with no roof and no coaxial machine gun, the 3-inch gun could be mounted onto the M4 chassis. Of course, this led to the M10. Being able to mount the 3-inch into the M4 as a tank destroyer, of course, is an entirely different kettle of fish to mounting it as a tank weapon. The M10 was an expedient, heavier than it needed to be simply because of the need to put dead weight on the back of the turret to balance out the gun on the front. A situation which would be exacerbated in the case of a proper turret with frontal armor and a machine gun in a tank which already was approaching the limits authorized for shipping and tactical bridging. The attempt to arm the 3-inch gun into the M4 medium was abandoned. Salvation was to come in the 76mm gun. The 3-inch gun was an older design, dating back quite a few years. The version eventually used by tank destroyers being a sort of a cobbling together of the barrel of the 3-inch anti-aircraft gun T9 and the breech and carriage of the 105mm M2 howitzer. Being something of a hack, however, it was anything but efficient, and in more recent years improvements in metallurgy had resulted in the possibility of a new design started from scratch, which in effect gave you the same 3-inch gun for half the weight, or a bigger gun for the same weight. Hence the split here between the 90mm, which would replace the 3-inch on M10s to make M36s, or the 76mm designed to fit where the 3-inch gun could not. The choice of the 76mm was a matter of rationalizing production. The 3-inch gun was a known quantity and apparently quite capable of performing the role for which it was intended. With production lines already set up for the projectiles, it made no sense to spin up yet another ammunition production line for projectiles for the new anti-tank gun, nor for the creation of a new set of machine tools for boring tubes in this new caliber. It also meant that it could shave off a whole bunch of time normally required for testing. As a result, the 76mm was placed into an M4 for trials in the summer of 1942. After the boffins at Aberdeen had finished putting it together and tested it to make sure it mechanically worked, sufficient faith was placed in the tank that it was standardized as a substitute vehicle, meaning it could be used instead of the 75mm tanks, so that the US forces would have an even better anti-tank capability for the likely invasion of North Africa later on in the year. Armoured Force were most pleased to hear of this development, worrying only that the larger gun would still carry a useful load of ammunition, and that it would not delay production of tanks overall, so as they wouldn't be held back from getting into the fight. It is worth observing at this point that nothing more troublesome than a Panzer IV had appeared on the German side, with the L-43 7.5cm gun taken to the field only a couple of months prior. Until then, the Shermans with their 75s had the match of the German tanks, and although the longer German gun had begun to equal the scales, it wasn't as if the 75mm was ineffective. Still, if the Americans could put a higher velocity cannon into the field, that meant that the US could engage accurately from further out. The importance of velocity at this point wasn't so much in penetration as much as the accuracy. A shorter time of flight means a flatter arc, more tolerance for range estimation errors, and less need for lead. This inherently gives the lie to two claims. Firstly, that the M4 was not supposed to engage enemy tanks. After all, they had just been given firepower equivalent to the in-service M10 Tank Destroyers, and what would eventually be placed onto the future M18 Tank Destroyer. The only reason for doing so is increased anti-tank capability. Secondly, that the US were not being proactive. They absolutely were, in giving the tanks more firepower than they currently needed, in case they needed more when the next wave of German tank improvements came out. Of course, this plan didn't happen. No 76mm tanks partook in Operation Torch or any operations in North Africa at all. That's because Armoured Force were not happy with it. You will recall from my various videos that I place great emphasis on ergonomics. It's all very well having the great technical capability on the tank, but if it cannot be efficiently used, what's the point? Well, Armoured Force had a similar philosophy. The 76mm conversion into the small M4 turret did indeed technically work. Indeed, such conversions would happen later on in the war in the field, and would also be distributed to Allied nations after the war when the US was disposing of its own surpluses. However, there were a slew of faults that, for the Americans, it was decided not worth building. Being, as there was, apparently no particular impression of being undergunned with the current tanks, it was possible to take the time and do it right. So Armoured Force told Ordnance Branch to throw it away and start over. Something else Ordnance had started over with at the same time was the basic tank design in the first place. With M4 production in full swing, Ordnance felt that they could devote some time towards designing an entirely new tank of increased protection and firepower as the M4 in production. Enter the T20 series of tanks, designed from the ground up to carry the 76mm. Unsurprisingly, being designed from the start to take the new gun, the turret configuration was far superior. Enter thus the Easy 6. Sherman was due for a midlife update in its design anyway. The steeply sloped frontal armour was difficult to make, the hull hatches were small, the internal volume limited, and the tank had a bit of a habit of catching fire more often than desired. Not any more than any other tank, mind, but more often than the Americans were happy with. The ride could also be improved a bit as well. All these various problems were addressed in the M4E6. The large hatch Sherman had less of a front slope, with thicker armour to compensate. The ammunition was put into wet stowage to reduce the chances of fire. A new horizontal volute suspension system was installed. And the 76mm turret was lifted off the T-23 medium tank and placed onto the M4. It was sent off for trials in June of 1943 and passed handily, with only minor tweaks required, to include rejecting the suspension system pending a redesign. By August 1943, the decision had been made. All US Army M4 medium tank production would switch to the 76mm gun. Of course, it would take time to retool the production lines, so the plan drawn up by the manufacturing section of Army Supply Forces envisioned production starting December 1944, with all of the production lines, barring a few contracts for rebuilds and the like, being changed over by February. Note, this was just US Army production. 75mm production would still continue for the Marines and export orders, plus of course eventually non-medium tanks like assault tanks, such as the Jumbo Sherman. Again, it is instructive to note the timeline against what the Germans were actually fielding. By the time this decision was made, the US was well enough familiar with Tigers, which were being used in small numbers, but though Ferdinand and Panther had just had their combat debut on the Russian front, no useful information about them had made the way to the US at the time. As far as the Americans knew, the 76mm gun could take care of anything they were likely to meet. Of course, once production starts, that's still quite different from fielding. Tanks produced in early 1944 still had to make their way to ports, get shipped over to the UK, and then issued to the field units. By the time D-Day preparations started with some 200 tanks in the UK, tank unit commanders were disinclined to hobble themselves by introducing a new tank to add to their training and logistical requirements. There seemed to be no need for them. This was the US's second mistake, and not really anything you can place the blame at to the feet of the design or doctrine guys in the US. The first mistake, possibly only truly knowable with the benefit of hindsight, was not creating the HVAP round until after the 76mm limitations were made clear. This was not a doctrinal failure, it was a failure in intelligence, both in the belief in the ability to penetrate the front of the German tanks and the numbers of those tougher tanks that they were liable to meet. Statisticians will probably be very familiar with the German tank problem. It's a fascinating assessment of how to determine just how many tanks the enemy has made by looking at serial numbers of those captured. The statistics were actually correct, but a little bit too late to help, really. It took a month for the 76mm tanks to be brought over to France, only to discover that the gun was not as capable against thick German frontal armour as had been hoped. The British had taken a different route with their own upgrade program. Those ergonomic issues which the US Armoured Force had decided were deal breakers in fielding the tank were considered to be just the cost of doing business for getting a hole puncher into the Sherman quickly enough to make a difference. Basically, it's the old argument between good enough now and perfect next week. In Normandy, Sherman Fireflies proved the wisdom of good enough now. The Korean War would prove the wisdom of perfect next week, with operations in late 44 and early 45 kind of splitting the difference. In any case, the fielding, finally, of the 76mm tank now gives us the Sherman yet again equipped with an equivalent gun to the tank destroyers. TDs never seem to get hammered for inadequate firepower, but the US M4s do for some reason. 75mm M4s did prove to retain their popularity though, because of their better high explosive round, which was what they tended to fire the most. The preference to retain 75mm even when given the option of moving to the 76mm at the time, though, is more of an incidental result than any doctrinal choice. So there is the story of how the 76mm M4 came to be. It was part of the policy of giving the tank the best anti-tank firepower it could have whilst retaining its usability and versatility. Its delay into service had nothing to do with doctrine, McNair's personal opinions on tank-on-tank combat or anything else notwithstanding. It was the result of deliberate and rational decision-making to get a new high-velocity gun into a tank with a minimum of disruption to the production and supply system, while simultaneously not landing the cruise with a tank which is more difficult to use than it needed to be. Hope you found the video interesting and informative, and we'll see you on the next one.